March 7, 1945. The heights overlooking Remagen, Germany. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard
Enderman lifted his binoculars with hands that shook not from fear, but from astonishment. Through the early afternoon haze, he observed something that contradicted every tactical assumption of the past 6
months.
The bridge still stood.
One bridge, the solitary bridge.
Every German commander from the Rhine to the Elbe had received explicit orders to demolish all crossings before Allied
forces could reach them. Yet there it remained, the Ludendorff Bridge, its twin.
Stone towers rising like monuments to German craftsmanship, its steel arches stretching across the 300 m of the Rhine River that represented Germany's last natural
barrier against invasion from the west. Lieutenant Karl Timberman standing beside Enderman voiced the thought that would echo through history. We have to seize it right now before they blow it to hell. What none of them realized in that moment was that the capture of this lone structure would trigger the most devastating strategic collapse in German military history, a psychological implosion of Nazi defensive doctrine so complete that German officers would later describe it as the moment they understood with absolute certainty that the war was lost. The
mathematics of this pivotal instant were being written not in the blood of soldiers but in the cold logic of
strategic geometry.
The Rhine was not merely a river, but a fortress 300 m
wide, with currents strong enough to overturn assault boats, depth sufficient to swallow armored vehicles, and banks steep enough to trap advancing infantry. Since the days when Roman legions first
peered across its waters into the Germanic forests, the Rhine had stood as central Germany's traditional shield
against invasion from the west. In March 1945, it represented Hitler's
final hope for gaining time to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies or to transfer divisions from the
collapsing Eastern Front for one last stand. The existence of a single intact bridge would obliterate that calculation in less than 10 minutes of combat.
The context of catastrophe had
been building for months.
The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive in the West, had ended in
ruin by late January 1945. What German propaganda had labeled a
decisive counteroffensive had instead exhausted the Wehrmacht's final mobile reserves. Approximately 100,000 German casualties, 600 tanks lost, and the irreplaceable depletion of veteran panzer divisions had left the German armies west of the Rhine as hollow remnants of
their former power.
By early March, 12 American divisions were driving
toward the river along a front stretching from the Netherlands to Switzerland. The German 15th Army, responsible for
defending the crucial sector between Cologne and Koblenz, could assemble barely 50,000 combat-capable troops against a
force 5 times that size. The bridge itself carried a bitter irony noted by both sides. Named after General Erich Ludendorff, Germany's brilliant but ultimately unsuccessful First World War strategist, the structure had been constructed between 1916 and 1919 primarily by Russian prisoners of war. Those prisoners laboring under brutal conditions had built their bridge too well. Steel trusses engineered to bear the weight of fully loaded military trains. Stone towers at each end containing 3 stories of defensive firing positions for massive stone piers sunk deep into the Rhine's bedrock.
The original plans called for demolition chambers built into the structure itself, cavities designed to hold explosives so the bridge could be destroyed before falling into enemy hands.
The French occupation forces,
after World War I, had filled those chambers with concrete. When Hitler retook the Rhineland in
1936, German engineers attached 60 zinc-lined boxes to the bridge's girders,
each intended to hold 3 kilograms of explosives.
The system was designed to detonate simultaneously, dropping the entire span into the Rhine in seconds. But fate and Hitler's paranoia had intervened in October 1944.
An American bomb struck the Mulheim Bridge in Cologne, igniting its prepositioned demolition charges and obliterating the bridge before German forces planned. Hitler's rage was volcanic.
He ordered the immediate court-martial of the officers responsible and demanded that all demolition charges on bridges be removed and stored nearby. New directives specified that charges could
only be reinstalled when Allied forces came within 8 kilometers and bridges could only be
destroyed by written authorization from sector commanders. The policy created a nightmare dilemma for German officers. Destroy a bridge too early and face a court-martial for eliminating vital retreat routes. Wait too long and face execution
for allowing strategic infrastructure to fall into enemy hands. The psychological strain paralyzed German decision-making at exactly the moment when decisive action was most essential.
The American advance toward
Remagen had been designated Operation Lumberjack, a modest name for what would become one of the most consequential
maneuvers of the entire war. The operation's primary objectives were the capture of Cologne and Koblenz, two
ancient cities controlling vital Rhine crossings.
The American First Army under Lieutenant
General Courtney Hodges pushed eastward through the Eifel region, facing German resistance that had deteriorated from
organized defense into desperate delaying tactics. The German commanders had no illusions about halting the American advance. Their orders were simply to delay, to gain time for more troops to retreat across the Rhine before the bridges were destroyed. Major General John Leonard's 9th Armored Division, nicknamed the Phantom Division because German intelligence repeatedly reported it annihilated only to encounter it again days later, led the American thrust. The morning of March 7 began with fog blanketing the Rhine Valley.
German command chaos had reached levels that would have been considered impossible in the Wehrmacht of 1940. General Edwin von Roth, commander of the 53rd Corps responsible for the Remagen sector, had accidentally wandered into American lines on March
6 and been captured. His replacement, General Richard von Offma, could not reach Ryan because American units had already cut the roads. At 1 o'clock in the morning on March 7, General Otto Hitzfeld of the 67th Corps was informed
that he now bore responsibility for defending the Ludendorff Bridge despite being 64 kilometers away and having never seen
the structure.
Hitzfeld immediately dispatched his adjutant, Major Hans Scheller, to take command of the bridge
defense. Scheller departed at 3 o'clock in the morning with 8 men and a radio, intending to commandeer retreating units to form a defensive perimeter.
The journey became a nightmare of wrong turns, American roadblocks, and fuel shortages.
The radio unit became separated. Scheller did not arrive at Remagen until 11:15, less than 2 hours before
American forces would crest the heights overlooking the town.
Captain Willy Bratka, the German commandant actually present at Remagen, commanded a force that existed more on paper than in reality. His official strength was listed as 600 men. The actual combat power consisted of 36
soldiers, most of them either wounded, elderly, or young boys from the Volkssturm
militia.
Many were Osttroppen, Soviet prisoners of war who had agreed to serve
in German uniform to escape prison camps. Their reliability in combat against Americans was questionable at best.
Brach had spent weeks pleading for reinforcements, for proper radio
equipment, for anything that might help him defend a strategic objective that everyone seemed to have forgotten until
the Americans appeared on the horizon.
His requests disappeared into the chaos of a collapsing command structure.
The demolition charges that should have been permanently installed on the bridge were
still stored in a nearby building, awaiting orders to be replaced. When those orders finally came on March 6,
engineer officers scrambled to emplace 2,800 kilograms of explosives in the piers and
attach 300 kg-shaped charges to critical structural points. The American approach on March 7 had an element of accidental destiny.
Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Enderman commanded a task force from the 9th Armored Division's Combat Command B,
consisting of elements from the 14th Tank Battalion and the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion.
Their orders were to capture the town of Remagen and then turn south to link up with the Third Army.
No one expected to find an intact bridge. American intelligence had confirmed that German engineers were systematically destroying
every Rhine crossing as Allied forces approached.
Photographers had documented the destruction of bridges at Cologne, Bonn and Koblenz. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen should have been demolished days earlier. When Enderman's lead elements emerged from the woods overlooking the town at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the sight that greeted them seemed almost surreal.
German military vehicles were still crossing the bridge.
Civilians crowded the approaches. The structure stood
intact, its demolition charges visible as dark shapes attached to the steelwork.
Lieutenant Karl Timberman, a 22-year-old platoon leader who had been born in Frankfurt, Germany in 1922, and had immigrated to the United States with his parents as an infant, would lead the assault. He spoke fluent German and
understood the significance of what they were seeing better than most.
The bridge represented something far more valuable than a crossing point. It represented the last barrier's failure, the final
natural obstacle overcome not by massive assault, but by a combination of luck and German paralysis. Brigadier General William Haug, commander of Combat Command B, arrived at the
heights at approximately 245.
He grasped the strategic implications
immediately.
This was not merely an opportunity to cross the Rhine, but a chance to vault 3 weeks ahead of Montgomery's meticulously planned Operation Plunder scheduled for late March.
Hoger made the decision that
would define his military career.
We're taking that bridge now. The German
defenders were caught in the worst possible tactical situation.
Major Scheller had arrived at the bridge.
Approached just over 2 hours earlier, exhausted from his nightmarish journey and stunned by what he found.
Captain Brach briefed him in minutes.
The bridge was prepared for demolition with electrical detonators controlled from
the eastern tunnel entrance.
A backup system consisted of a fuse that could be lit manually.
The defensive perimeter was non-existent.
Most of the troops Scheller expected to commandeer were already across the bridge or bypassing Remagen entirely.
The fog that had blanketed the morning
had lifted at precisely the wrong moment, giving American artillery observers perfect visibility.
At approximately 3:15 in the afternoon, American tanks appeared at the western approach to the town. The time for
deliberation had ended. The assault on Remagen town itself took less than 30
minutes. Lieutenant John Grimble's platoon of M26 Pershing tanks, the newest and most powerful American tanks in the European theater, led the advance.
The Pershings were so new that most German troops had never seen them.
Armed with 90mm guns capable of penetrating any German armor, they represented yet another symbol of American industrial supremacy.
The tanks fired white phosphorus rounds to create smokescreens and hammered German positions with high explosive shells.
Timberman's
infantry followed, moving through streets that showed the scars of years of Allied bombing.
Remagen had been a picturesque Rhine resort town before the war. By March 1945, more than half its
buildings had been reduced to rubble. The few German soldiers attempting to defend the town fell back quickly.
Most
simply fled across the bridge. Captain Brad, watching the American advance from his position near the bridge's western tower, knew the moment had arrived.
At 3:20, he gave the order to blow the western approach ramp. The explosion created a crater 3 m wide, preventing
American tanks from driving directly onto the bridge, but the main structure remained standing.
The race for the
bridge became a matter of minutes and meters.
American tanks positioned themselves at the western end, their 90mm guns hammering German positions on the eastern heights. The Erl, a 180mm basalt cliff rising on the eastern bank, bristled with German anti-aircraft guns that now depressed their barrels to fired directly at American troops. Timberman's infantry, approximately 120
men from a company, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, began moving across
the bridge at approximately 350.
They advanced in short rushes, using the
bridge's stone towers and railings for cover. German machine guns opened fire
from the eastern towers and from positions in the tunnel mouth beyond. Bullets ricocheted off steel and stone, creating a deadly crossfire.
Several Americans fell in the first seconds. The rest kept advancing. Major Scheller, watching from the tunnel entrance on the eastern side, faced the most consequential decision any German officer would make that day.
The bridge was loaded with explosives.
The electrical detonation system was ready. American troops were halfway across.
Every instinct, every principle of military doctrine demanded he blow the bridge immediately.
But Lieutenant Karl
Peters of the anti-aircraft artillery had approached him minutes earlier with a desperate plea.
Peters commanded a
battery equipped with the new Henschel HS-297 rocket launcher system, a top-secret
weapon that fired 24 high-velocity anti-aircraft rockets with unprecedented accuracy. The battery was still on the western side of the bridge.
Peters could not allow this advanced technology to fall into American hands.
Scheller agreed to wait.
The decision would cost him his life.
Captain Karl Senhen, the combat
engineer responsible for the demolition charges, positioned himself at the electrical detonator in the tunnel
mouth. When Peters' battery finally cleared the bridge, Friesenhan received the order from Scheller. At approximately 4 o'clock, with American troops 2/3 of the way across, Senhen turned the key. Nothing happened.
The electrical system had failed. A shell had likely cut the wiring earlier, though no one would ever
determine the exact cause with certainty.
Sergeant Alex Drabik, a 34-year-old from Toledo, Ohio, became the first American soldier to set foot on the eastern bank of the Rhine since Napoleon's armies had crossed in the opposite direction over a century earlier. Behind him, Timberman and the rest of a company kept coming.
Engineer Sergeant Eugene Dorland and his team began systematically cutting every wire they could find, racing to disconnect the remaining demolition charges before German engineers could activate the backup system. Corporal Anton Faust, a
German engineer, volunteered for a desperate mission. He ran from the tunnel, dashed across approximately 100 m under direct fire, and ignited the backup fuse by hand.
The explosion that followed at approximately 4:15 sent shock waves through the structure.
The bridge lifted
several inches off its foundations, then settled back. Smoke and debris filled the air. American soldiers on the bridge were thrown to the deck.
But when the smoke cleared, the structure still
stood.
The main steel arches had been damaged, but remained intact.
The 6 inches sag in the road was traversable.
The bridge held.
The race was over. The Americans had won. The immediate aftermath was chaos controlled by training and determination.
American combat engineers swarmed onto the bridge, working frantically to remove the remaining demolition charges
and repair the damage to the approach ramp. Lieutenant Colonel Harvey Fraser's
27th Armored Infantry Battalion began establishing a defensive perimeter on the eastern side, expanding from the
tunnel entrance across the slopes of the Apile. German resistance collapsed with stunning rapidity.
Captain Bratta and most of his remaining troops took shelter in the 400 m railroad tunnel
that ran beneath the lay.
By 5:30 in the evening, Lieutenant Timman and his men had secured the tunnel entrance and captured several hundred prisoners, most of them relieved that their war was
over. Major Scheller made a fatal decision born of desperation.
Realizing that the bridge was lost and that he bore formal responsibility for its defense, he commandeered a bicycle and rode east to find his corps. headquarters and explain what had happened. He would be arrested 4 days later, court-martialed, and executed by firing squad as a scapegoat for a failure that had dozens of fathers. News of the Bridges' capture traveled up the American chain of command with the speed of an electrical current. At approximately 5 o'clock, Brigadier General Hoger radioed his division commander, Major General John Leonard, with words that were true and miraculous in equal measure. "We got the bridge." Leonard immediately relayed the information to 1st Army Headquarters. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges was conferring with his staff when the call came through. According to witnesses, Hodges grabbed the telephone so quickly he knocked over his coffee. Within minutes, he was on the line with 12th Army Group Commander General Omar Bradley. Bradley was in a meeting with his operations officer, Major General Harold Bull, when an aide interrupted with an urgent call. "Brad, we've got a bridge," Hodges said, his voice vibrating with excitement. "A bridge? You mean you've got one intact on the Rhine?" Bradley asked, standing up from his desk. "Yep," Leonard nabbed one at Reagan before they could blow it up. Bradley's response became legendary among the American High Command. "Hot dog. Courtney. This will bust him wide open. Are you getting your stuff across?" "Just as fast as we can push it over," Hodges replied. Bradley immediately called Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower at his headquarters in Reus, France. Eisenhower grasped the significance instantly. The capture represented what he later described as one of those rare and fleeting opportunities that occasionally arise in war and which, if grasped, have incalculable effects on determining future success. Eisenhower's original plan had called for Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group to make the primary Rhine crossing near Wesel in late March, supported by elaborate airborne operations and massive artillery preparations. The American crossing was supposed to be secondary, smaller in scale, carefully coordinated. The Remagen Bridge changed everything. Eisenhower ordered Bradley to exploit the bridgehead immediately. Every available unit was to be diverted to Remagen. The strategic focus of the entire Western Front shifted south in a matter of hours. The German reaction was a study in command paralysis and murderous scapegoating. When news reached Adolf Hitler at his headquarters in Berlin, his response combined strategic despair with homicidal rage. Hitler had been clinging to increasingly delusional hopes that the Rhine would buy him time to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. The entire German defensive strategy in the West hinged on using the river as a barrier behind which shattered divisions could be reconstituted and redeployed. An intact American bridgehead 3 weeks ahead of schedule demolished that strategy. Hitler's immediate response was to find someone to blame and kill them. He summoned General Lieutenant Rudolf Hubner, a fanatical Nazi known for his ruthlessness from the Eastern Front. Hubner was given command of a flying special court-martial with orders to try and execute the officers responsible for losing the bridge. The court-martial would be a legal fiction, a traveling execution squad with judicial pretensions. Hubner was accompanied by 2 lieutenant colonels and 2 military policemen who served as the firing squad. None of the officers had legal training. Hubner explicitly rejected offers of copies of the German military code of justice, declaring that the only authority he needed was Hitler's personal order. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundert, the aristocratic commander of all German forces in the West, was dismissed from his position on March 10. Hitler's paranoia demanded a scapegoat of appropriate rank. Rundstedt was replaced by Field Marshal Albert Kessler, who was hastily transferred from command of German forces in Italy. Kessler Ring was a capable defensive tactician known as Hitler's firefighter for his ability to stabilize deteriorating situations. But Even Kessler recognized immediately that the situation at Remagen was beyond stabilization. He later described the bridge's loss as the crime of Remagen, stating that it broke the front along the Rhine and made
sustained defense impossible.
Hermann Göring, commander of the rapidly disintegrating Luftwaffe, was more blunt.
In his assessment,
the capture of the bridge, he said, made a long defense impossible. The psychological impact extended beyond words. German officers, who had maintained some hope of holding the Rhine, now understood that the war
was entering its final phase.
The flying court-martial began its work with
murderous efficiency.
General Major Richard von Bothma, who had nominal command of the Bonn and Remagen sector,
despite never reaching the bridge, was tried on March 9.
He was convicted of dereliction of duty, demoted to private and sentenced to 5 years in prison.
Von
Bothma, whose wife was dead and whose son had been killed in the war, grabbed a pistol from a court official and shot
himself in the courtroom on March 10.
On March 11, the court-martial arrived at Field Marshal Model's Army Group B headquarters.
4 officers were tried that day in proceedings that lasted less than an hour each. Major Hans Scheller was convicted of failing to blow the bridge,
despite having arrived only 2 hours before the American attack and having done everything humanly possible under
impossible circumstances.
Lieutenant Karl Peters was convicted of allowing his secret rocket launcher to fall into American hands despite having pleaded for time to get his equipment
across.
Major August Kraft and Major Herbert Straubel, combat engineers who had laid the original charges days earlier and were 60 kilometers away when the bridge was captured, were convicted of
insufficient preparation of the demolition system. All 4 men were sentenced to death. The executions were
carried out on March 14, 1945 in the forests near the small villages of
Rimbach and Oberursen.
The 4 officers were led into the woods, forced to kneel, and shot in the
back of the neck.
They were buried in unmarked shallow graves where they fell. Captain Willy Bratt, who had actually commanded the bridge defense and had done more than anyone to prepare its
demolition, was tried in absentia and also sentenced to death.
But Bratka was already an American prisoner, captured in the tunnel on March 7. Captain Karl Senhen, the engineer who had actually attempted to detonate the charges, was also in American custody.
Senhen was tried in absentia and acquitted, a rare moment of judicial rationality in the proceedings.
Field Marshal Model personally endorsed the executions, and ordered that news of them be distributed to every unit in the
German military as a warning. The message was clear.
Failure would be punished with death regardless of
circumstances. While German officers were being executed for losing the bridge, American forces were pouring across it in numbers that grew by the hour. The bridge itself remained standing, but was clearly damaged.
Engineers worked around the clock to shore up weakened sections and repair the approach ramp.
A combat engineer battalion erected lights for nighttime traffic. Military police directed the flow of men and vehicles. Within 24
hours of the capture, more than 8,000 American troops had crossed into the bridge head on the eastern bank.
Tank
companies, artillery batteries, infantry battalions, all flowing across the only
intact Rhine bridge between Switzerland and the North Sea. But the Americans knew the bridge could collapse at any moment. Combat engineers began construction of tactical bridges immediately. By March 9, 48 hours
after the capture, the first tactical bridge was completed.
An M1940 aluminum alloy treadway bridge erected just north of the Ludendorff Bridge. Work began immediately on a second pontoon bridge.
The American plan was to make the bridgehead irreversible regardless of what happened to the original structure.
The German response to the bridgehead was everything Hitler's strategic reserves could muster, which by March 1945 meant a collection of ad hoc battle groups
thrown together from shattered divisions and rear echelon units. The Luftwaffe which had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength, launched repeated air attacks against the bridge.
Over the next 10 days, American intelligence counted 367 separate German air sorties targeting the Remagen area.
The Americans responded by assembling the largest concentration of anti-aircraft
artillery in the European theater. 5 anti-aircraft battalions with hundreds
of guns created a defensive box around the bridge.
The anti-aircraft battles
became some of the most intense of the entire war.
American gunners claimed to
have shot down more than 100 German aircraft in the 10 days following the bridge's capture.
The Germans employed their newest technology in desperate attempts to destroy the bridge. Ardo R-234
jet bombers, the world's first operational jet bombers, attacked in diving runs that exceeded 800 km/h. The jets were nearly impossible to intercept, but their bombing accuracy at high speed was poor. Most of their bombs missed the bridge. The Germans also deployed the Messerschmitt
Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. These aircraft, faster than anything the Allies could field, represented German technological innovation at its peak. But technology could not overcome the fundamental problem.
There were too few aircraft, too little fuel, too few experienced
pilots.
The German air attacks inflicted casualties and damage, but failed to destroy either the original bridge or the tactical bridges being erected alongside it.
Hitler personally
authorized the use of V-2 rockets against the bridge, marking the first and only time these strategic weapons were employed against a tactical target. The V-2, a ballistic missile that reached
speeds exceeding 5,000 km/h, was designed to terrorize London, not to hit
precise military targets.
11 V-2s were launched at Remagen from launch sites in the Netherlands 130 kilometers away.
The rockets killed a handful of American soldiers and an unknown number of German civilians in nearby towns.
Not one hit the bridge. The Germans sent frogmen down the Rhine. 7 naval demolition
specialists wearing Italian-made underwater breathing apparatus.
The Americans detected them using canal defense lights, a secret technology that projected intense beams across the water surface. All 7 frogmen were killed or captured.
The Germans floated explosive-laden boats down the river, mines disguised as logs, even deployed the Calgaret, a 600mm super-heavy siege mortar that fired shells weighing over
2 tons.
The Calgaret was one of the largest artillery pieces ever built.
Its
shells could demolish fortifications in a single hit, but the weapon's accuracy was limited, and moving it into position
took days.
The few shells that were fired at the bridge missed.
The
psychological impact of all this German effort was the opposite of what Hitler intended.
Every failed attack on the bridge reinforced American morale while demonstrating German desperation.
American soldiers fighting in the bridgehead understood they were witnessing the death throes of the Wehrmacht.
German soldiers understood it too.
Prisoners captured in the bridgehead fighting expressed relief that their war was
over. Many had been expecting orders to counterattack the bridge, orders they knew would be suicide missions. The American presence across the Rhine destroyed whatever hope remained that Germany could avoid total defeat. The strategic calculations were brutally simple.
With American forces already across the Rhine in strength, the river had ceased to function as a defensive
barrier. Every German division deployed to contain the Remagen bridgehead was a
division unavailable to defend against the massive Allied crossing operations planned for late March.
The German defensive front was being pulled apart by forces it could no longer contain.
Major General Karl Vanner, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Walter Model,
later provided the most concise German assessment of Remagen's strategic impact. The capture of the bridge signaled the end of the war for Germany.
Var stated in post-war interrogations. The Remagen affair caused a great feeling of guilt and shame among the German command.
It demonstrated that the
Allies now had complete initiative and that German forces could only react,
never seize the advantage.
The failure to destroy the bridge symbolized the complete breakdown of German command and
control. The inability to execute even basic military operations.
For German officers trained in the Prussian tradition of military excellence,
this failure cut deep. It
was not merely a tactical defeat but a moral collapse. Proof that the Wehrmacht that had conquered Europe in 1940 had disintegrated beyond recognition.
The bridge collapsed on March 17 at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The structure had stood for 10 days under conditions no engineer had ever anticipated.
American traffic had been continuous, thousands of vehicles crossing and recrossing.
German artillery had scored direct hits and near misses.
Air attacks had caused cumulative damage.
The
vibrations from nearby explosions had stressed metal fatigued by decades of use and the failed German demolition
attempt on March 7. Witnesses reported hearing rivets popping like gunshots in
the minutes before the collapse. A vertical hanger on the southern arch snapped, then another.
The entire center
span lifted briefly, then fell into the Rhine with a roar that could be heard for kilometers.
28 American combat engineers died in the collapse with over 60 injured. Most were
members of the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion who had been working on repairs at the moment of failure.
The irony was bitter.
The men who had saved the bridge through their frantic work to disarm German demolition charges now
died because their repairs could not overcome the accumulated damage.
But by the time the bridge fell, it had become
strategically irrelevant. American combat engineers had completed 2
tactical bridges and were finishing a 3rd. Pontoon bridges, treadway bridges, and Bailey bridges now spanned
the Rhine at multiple points near Remagen.
More than 25,000 American troops had crossed the damaged Ludendorff
bridge before it fell. After its collapse, the rate of crossing actually
increased because the tactical bridges could handle heavier traffic. By March 25, 18 days after the bridge's initial capture, over 125,000 American troops had crossed the Rhine at
Remagen. 6 entire divisions with their tanks, artillery, and supply trains had established themselves east of the river.
The bridgehead was 8 miles
deep and 25 miles wide. It included 11 kilometers of the critical autobahn connecting the Ruhr industrial region with Frankfurt. American forces were positioned to drive deep into central Germany.
The breakout from the Remagen bridgehead began on March 25. American armored divisions that had been constrained by the narrow bridgehead perimeter suddenly exploded eastward.
Combat Command B of the 9th
Armored Division covered 108 kilometers in a single day.
Combat Command A advanced 110 kilometers in 11 hours. German resistance, which had been fierce in the narrow
confines around the bridge, evaporated across the wider front.
Entire German units surrendered rather than face annihilation. On March 29, Combat
Command A captured more than 200 prisoners in a single engagement.
The
American advance was so rapid that German commanders lost track of their own units.
Field Marshal Model's Army
Group B, which had numbered approximately 325,000 men before the Remagen breakout, began
to disintegrate. Divisions lost contact with Corps headquarters. CPS lost contact with Army commands.
The command structure that had held the Wehrmacht together through 5 years of war was coming apart.
The strategic implications cascaded through the German defensive system.
Field Marshal Model found himself commanding an army group that was simultaneously trying to defend against the Remagen bridgehead, contain American forces breaking out from other Rhine crossing sites and prevent encirclement of the Ruhr industrial region. All three objectives were impossible to achieve with the forces available.
The RUR, Germany's industrial heart and the
source of 80% of its coal and steel production, was about to be cut off. Model understood that losing the Ruhr meant losing any possibility of continued war production.
Without coal and steel, the Wehrmacht could not replace losses, could not fuel its vehicles, could not manufacture ammunition.
The loss of Remagen Bridge had created the conditions for the loss of the RU.
The loss of the RU meant the end of the war.
By March 31, 3 weeks after the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge, all four American armies operating on the Western Front had crossed the Rhine.
The crossing that
Allied planners had anticipated would require elaborate amphibious operations, massive casualties, and weeks of fighting had been accomplished with stunning speed.
The Rhine, which had held the Roman
legions at bay and served as Germany's western rampart for 2 millennia, had been breached at multiple points in less
than a month.
Eisenhower's assessment captured the magnitude of the achievement. "We were across the Rhine on a permanent bridge," he wrote in his memoirs.
The traditional defensive barrier to the
heart of Germany was pierced. The final defeat of the enemy, which we had long calculated would be accomplished in the spring and summer campaigning of 1945, was suddenly now in our minds, just
around the corner.
The American assessment was echoed by observers from other nations.
War correspondents
declared that the war had been shortened by months.
British Field Marshal Bernard
Montgomery, whose carefully planned Operation Plunder Rhine crossing had been eclipsed by the American success at Remagen, acknowledged the strategic significance.
Soviet commanders, watching the rapid Allied advance from the east, accelerated their own operations to ensure they reached Berlin first.
The race for Germany had become a sprint, and the starting gun had been fired at Remagen. German military authorities offered varying assessments of how much the loss of the bridge had shortened the war. Some claimed weeks, others months. The truth was that precise calculations were impossible because the strategic effects were systemic rather than linear.
The
Bridge's capture had not merely advanced the Allied timetable, but had fundamentally altered German strategic
options. Before Remagen, German commanders could imagine holding the Rhine through April and possibly into
May, using the time to reinforce defenses around Berlin and negotiate with the Western Allies for a separate
peace that would allow concentration against the Soviets. After Remagen, such calculations became fantasy.
The Rhine had fallen 3 weeks ahead of schedule.
German reserves that should
have been used to defend against Montgomery's crossing in the north had been consumed in futile attempts to
eliminate the Remagen bridge head.
The psychological impact on German troops
was incalculable but devastating. Colonel F. Russell Lyons, the 3rd Corps
engineer whose men had captured and held the bridge, estimated that having an intact bridge saved the Allies 2 months
of fighting and 35,000 casualties. This calculation was based on comparing
the Remagen crossing with the amphibious operations required at other Rhine crossing sites.
At Wel, where
Montgomery's Operation Plunder unfolded, the British and Americans assembled over 200 artillery pieces, conducted elaborate airborne drops, and suffered substantial casualties despite overwhelming superiority. At Remagen, American forces had crossed with minimal casualties because the bridge eliminated the need for assault
boats, the most vulnerable phase of any river crossing. Historian Ken Heckler,
who conducted extensive post-war interviews with participants from both sides, concluded that the capture of the
Ludendorff Bridge materially hastened the ending of the war. Other historians
suggested the capture shortened the war by approximately 6 months.
The variations in estimates reflected different methodologies and assumptions, but the consensus was clear. Remagen had been a turning point. The human cost of the bridge's capture and defense provides another measure of its significance.
American casualties in the Battle of Remagen and the subsequent fighting in the bridgehead totaled Approximately 860 killed with nearly 5,700 wounded and an approximately equal
number missing.
These were heavy losses, but they were concentrated in the first 18 days of fighting from March 7 to March 25. German casualties in the same period exceeded 11,700 prisoners alone, with killed and wounded numbers that were never accurately tallied, but certainly exceeded 10,000. The disparity reflected the fundamental
imbalance of forces.
The Americans had air superiority, artillery superiority, armored superiority, and the psychological advantage of knowing they were winning. The Germans had orders to counterattack that they could not fulfill, equipment that was breaking down, and the growing certainty that the war was lost.
The executions of the German officers held responsible for
losing the bridge cast a dark shadow over the military's honor code. Major Hans Scheller had been a 31-year-old career officer who had served with distinction on both the Eastern and Western fronts.
He had been married and
had young children he would never see grow up. His crime had been arriving at the bridge 2 hours before it was captured and failing to perform a miracle with 36 exhausted soldiers against several thousand Americans, supported by tanks and artillery.
Lieutenant Karl Peters had been a technical specialist trying to save secret equipment from capture.
His execution occurred despite testimony that he had acted in accordance with
standing orders to preserve advanced technology. Majors Kraft and Strobel had been following standard procedures for preparing demolition charges.
None of the 4 men deserved death.
All 4
were scapegoats for a system that had collapsed from the top.
After the war, General Lieutenant Rudolf
Hubner, who had conducted the flying court-martial, was tried by German courts and sentenced to 4 years in
prison for his role in the illegal executions. It was a modest sentence for judicial
murder, but it established that even in Germany's darkest hour, some officers had recognized that the trials were a
travesty.
The final assessment of Remagen's significance must include its role in the Allied strategic debate about how to end the war. Before Remagen, there had been serious discussion about whether to halt at the Rhine and allow the Soviets to bear the brunt of the final assault on Germany. Some British and American planners argued that crossing the Rhine would be costly and that Soviet forces attacking from the east could accomplish the same objective with less Western loss of life.
Remagen made that debate moot.
With American forces already across the Rhine and expanding their bridgehead, halting made no strategic sense.
The
momentum must be maintained. The rapid advance from the Rhine to the Elbe River, accomplished in just over a
month, vindicated that decision.
American forces met Soviet forces at
Toga on April 25, cutting Germany in two. By May 8, Germany had surrendered unconditionally.
The bridge's capture had reverberations beyond the immediate military situation. In the United States, news of the capture reached the Senate while in session. The leadership suspended its rule against applause and senators stood and cheered.
Newspapers across America ran headlines declaring that the end of the war in Europe was in sight. War bond
sales surged. The psychological impact on American public morale was substantial. After years of war, after tens of thousands of casualties, victory was finally tangible and near.
In
Germany, news of the bridge's loss spread through the military and civilian population with demoralizing effect. Germans had been told by propaganda that the Rhine was impregnable, that the Allies would shatter themselves against
its defenses.
The discovery that the Rhine had been crossed almost casually, that a single bridge had remained intact through a combination of American luck and German dysfunction, destroyed what little faith remained in the regime's competence. The physical remains of the Ludendorff
bridge tell their own story. After the war, the structure was not rebuilt. The
twisted steel and broken stone were cleared from the Rhine, but the towers on both banks remained standing.
The
Western towers were eventually converted into a peace museum.
The Friedensmuseum Brick von Maragon. The museum's exhibits trace the bridge's history from its construction through its destruction with special attention to the March 1945 battle and its consequences. The eastern towers on the side now serve as a performing arts space. The contrast between their wartime and PCE muses is deliberate, a statement that destruction can give way to creation. The soldiers who captured the bridge received recognition commensurate with their achievement. Lieutenant Karl Timberman was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. Sergeant Alex Dravik received the same decoration. Dozens of other soldiers from the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion and the 14th Tank Battalion received Silver Stars and Bronze Stars. Brigadier General William Hoger was promoted and received command of a corps. The entire 9th Armored Division received a Presidential Unit Citation for its actions at Remagen. These awards recognized individual and collective bravery, but they could not capture the full significance of what had been accomplished. The men who crossed the bridge under fire had not merely secured a tactical objective. They had participated in a moment that changed the trajectory of the war. Every day the war was shortened meant thousands of lives saved, both military and civilian. The soldiers who fought at Remagen contributed directly to that outcome. The Riemann story raises profound questions about the role of chance in history. If the fog had not lifted when it did, would American scouts have seen the bridge before it was blown? If the electrical detonation system had functioned properly, would the bridge have been destroyed with American troops on it? If Major Scheller had arrived 2 hours earlier, would he have had time to organize a defense that could have delayed the Americans, if Hitler had not ordered the removal of explosives after the Cologne incident? Would the Reyeren charges have been properly positioned and operational? Each of these questions implies a different outcome, a version of history in which the bridge was destroyed and the Rhine crossing unfolded according to the original Allied schedule. The layering of contingencies that resulted in the bridge's capture suggests that history is not predetermined, that individual choices and unforeseen events can produce consequences far beyond what anyone expected. The final judgment must return to the human dimension. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge was the achievement of men operating under conditions of extreme pressure and danger. Lieutenant Tim Mann leading his company across a bridge that might detonate at any moment. Sergeant Drake racing toward the eastern bank, while German machine guns targeted him. The combat engineers who labored under fire to neutralize demolition charges. The tank crews who offered covering fire from the western bank. The staff officers who recognized the opportunity and made the decision to grasp it. The commanders who redirected entire armies to exploit the breakthrough. Each individual in this chain made decisions that shaped the outcome. Remove any single link and the result might have shifted entirely. This acknowledgement of personal agency within broader historical forces is what makes the story compelling. The men at Remagen were not pieces in a game of historical inevitability, but participants who molded events through their courage and choices. The 80th anniversary of the bridge's capture in March 2025 was observed with ceremonies in both Remagen and the United States. Veterans organizations, historical societies, and military units that traced their heritage to the 9th Armored Division took part in events honoring the soldiers who fought there. The German government recognized the battle's importance while underscoring lessons about the cost of conflict and the value of peace. The commemorations reflected the event's layered legacy. For Americans, it was a moment of victory, a confirmation of bravery and decisive leadership. For Germans, it was a reminder of defeat, but also of liberation from Nazism. For historians, it served as a case study in how contingency and determinism intersect in warfare. For all participants, it was
A reminder that choices made in moments of crisis can shape the trajectory of history. The men who captured the bridge at Remagen could not have known that their actions would become the focus of books, films, and
scholarly analyses. They were soldiers fulfilling their duty in circumstances none of them would have chosen. That their duty produced outcomes of global historical significance is a testament to the unpredictable nature of war and the enduring importance of courage.